before I do anything else, I just want to thank Scott and Justin for putting together such a fabulous panel. I am so excited about the things I'm going to see today, and they're going to shape how we think about digital rhetoric going forward. What I'm going to talk about today a little bit is this book thing that I did. It's called Digital Rhetoric Theory, Method, Practice. And I like that we're starting out with a PowerPoint so you can see like the infrastructure of the technology needed to do all this work. But I'm going to go ahead and switch into the actual presentation mode. So just to tell you a little bit about this project, what my interest was at the time of writing it was how to kind of map out the landscape of what counts and what constitutes digital rhetoric, and think of it more as a field than as a set of methods or a set of theories or a set of practices discretely. I really want to be thinking about how digital rhetoric can be constituted as a specific kind of disciplinary locus, right? And this is partly prompted because there's this big rise in this interest in digital humanities, right? And so part of my interest is in seeing something that's a little bit more concrete. For me, digital humanities is an empty signifier. It doesn't really do anything. It gets us money, right? So it's useful in that sense. But it doesn't really have a central core. There's no center that you can point to and say, digital humanities always has X at the center. On the other hand, digital rhetoric always has rhetoric at the center, right? And so this is where I want to start talking a little bit about what I'm doing. And I'm going to front load what I'm talking about today, primarily with histories and definitions. I'm going to only briefly touch on the theories, methods, practices, and pedagogies points, because I think those are the places that we're going to be really engaging as we go throughout the day today and tomorrow. So I don't really want to get deeply into those. Also, I've been told I only have like an hour to talk, right? And so I want to make sure I cover the important stuff first. So rhetoric, the thing about rhetoric that I think we want to start, and obviously many of us are rhetoricians in the room, we know what rhetoric is, and so please excuse me that I'm going to talk a little bit about rhetoric from a very basic standpoint. But I do this because I find that digital rhetoric has at its core, at its heart, rhetoric, right? Rhetoric needs to be there. Liz mentioned something last night about methods and where we can pull methods from. And this is the thing that I want us to be cognizant of and careful about, is that we always go back to rhetoric, both as theory and method, as part of digital rhetoric, and not lose sight of that. Many of the things I'm going to talk about this morning are about not losing sight of things that I think are important. And of course, this is fairly idiosyncratic. And in fact, the whole book, I started off my book by telling you that I come up from a particular background, particular training, particular disciplines. So my vision of the history of digital rhetoric is going to look different, for instance, than somebody from media arts, right? So my version of rhetoric is very different than, say, Lev Nanovich's version of new media, right? Lev has no interest in rhetoric per se, even though he does it quite a bit, he won't really acknowledge that. So there's a whole kind of push and pull that's happening between the different disciplines that are now informing digital rhetoric. This is something I think is really, really interesting and something that we should pay attention to. But to go back to rhetoric, I'm sure none of you have ever seen this before, right? So here's the classical rhetoric, Western tradition, Aristotelian definition of rhetoric that's often used, right? And so the one thing I want to say is that it's useful to start here, although other people will claim starting points and say Socrates or the Sophists, which is also very useful starting points. But I want us to be thinking about how classical rhetoric can be applied. This gets into the question of methods and theories. Can we apply classical rhetoric to digital texts and digital performances, or do we need to come up with new methods and new theories? This is kind of the heart of what's going on in digital rhetoric now, and I think we'll see that play out today and tomorrow. The one thing I want to note about this, aside from it being a reasonably good starting point because so many people know it, is that this definition doesn't really include action, right? It includes discovery, but it doesn't talk much about what you do once you've discovered those means. And so I think we want to be careful to have a broad and kind of encompassing knowledge or thought about what rhetoric is and does. And so I'm going to show you a couple of my favorite, and of course, there are literally thousands of definitions of rhetoric that have been put out between Aristotle and now, and people keep coming up with them. So I'm going to show you just a few exemplary ones that I think connect pretty well to the notion of digital rhetoric in particular. All right. As this is somewhat more recent, in 2007, Davis and Shadle said that rhetoric is syncretic and generative practice, creates new knowledge by posing questions differently. And so what I like about this is this idea of the newness, traditional forms and commonplaces being reframed, revised, remediated, is embedded within this kind of notion. This is where I think rhetoric has the power to move digital rhetoric forward really directly. And to not lose sight of the way that things like media arts and creativity and creative action comes in as rhetorical practice. I think too often rhetorical practice gets kind of sidelined as a kind of mechanism for analysis, and we spend less time paying attention to how we use it for production. And digital rhetoric is a great place to be thinking about rhetoric for production. Okay. The other points, I've got only two more. I'm not going to give you the thousands. Right? There are many that I really like. This one I wanted to note in particular because of the way that Burke talks about, and Burke in some cases talks about men in particular, but I want to go back to his talking about inducing cooperation in beings that by nature respond to symbol. And this is, I want to take a little bit of an aside because I know that there's this question, and many people are going to talk about algorithms today, for instance. Can algorithms have agency? Can they perform rhetorically? And I want to stake out a claim here that rhetoric requires humans in some fashion, right? So this is not to say that algorithms can't be rhetorical. They can be rhetorical agents and use rhetorical practices, but the algorithms themselves have to be programmed by humans. I want to kind of touch back to how Latour looks at the way we build machines to observe the world and pretend that we're having a kind of real observation absent human intervention, but those machines were made by people. So as digital rhetoricians, I want us to always go back to the people that are making the algorithms, the people that are making the machines. I don't want us to lose sight of the people part of it. So this is my kind of first big stakeout claim, that digital rhetoric also always has to have humans at the center, right, as part of the rhetorical practice. I know some people will argue with that, so that'll be fun. This one I just always use because I really, really like the idea that we use rhetoric to alter reality. And as we move into worlds where we're using a lot more augmented reality, alternate reality games, we're going to see these things actually happen more directly, right? It's less of a theoretical altering of reality as it is an actual altering of reality, a physical altering, an altering that we can see and respond to and react to. If you haven't seen it already, and there's a big question about whether or not Magic Leap is real, but check out Magic Leap and what they're doing. That could be, a version of the altering reality via rhetorical practice. Okay, so we've talked about rhetoric, right, as a center. But I want to take just a second to talk about digital, because often we just stick digital at the beginning of the term called digital rhetoric and don't really interrogate what we mean by digital. So there's 3 points I want to quickly cover here. So in a technical sense, right, digital just means it's made up of discrete values, right? Whereas the analog is usually represented as a continuous wave, does not have discrete values. So in the technical sense, something like writing, the alphabetic text is digital, right? Braille is digital. Morse code is digital because it's made up of discrete units. We don't usually use it in this way. Usually we think about it as encoding of binary digits, right? Ones and zeros, ons and offs. And this is the way that we tend to incorporate and use it in digital rhetoric now. But I want us to remember, and this is something Angela Haas had come up with when we were working together on with a project called Digirect.net. And she said, reminded us that digital goes back to the body, right? Fingers, digits, from the Latin. So again, I want to call on us as digital rhetoricians to not forget about the body behind the technology, right? The idea that we are embodied, that there are material conditions both to making the technology and using the technology, the labor is involved, that there are people there, again, getting the humans back into the equation. I'm also going to talk about text just briefly. In the book, I spent a lot of time talking about text. And this sounds kind of maybe a little old school or odd coming from somebody who runs Kairos, which is all about not text, right? You shouldn't be able to print out the things that we publish. But I use text in a very broad sense, and I think it's a useful way of thinking about a kind of container, right? So Jonathan Iwala talks about text as being any object, collection of objects, or context can be read, right? Therefore, they can be text. This is a kind of standard cultural studies approach to thinking about anything that can be read and can be textual. So I want to think about text as digital rhetoricians as a kind of marker for the kinds of things that we do and the objects of study that we have. So I'm using it in this very broad way. So if you ever hear me talk about text, I'm not talking about print or alphabetic text. I'm using this kind of expanded notion. And this thing, I also want to make a real clear connection. And this comes back to me, especially when it comes to practice and pedagogy. And that is the notion that text is design. Design has a really strong function to play within digital rhetoric. I think we need to pay attention to and use design as much as we use rhetoric, as much as we use code, which is something I'll come back to in a minute. All right. I know I'm running through this really fast, but I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to have conversations about it. So the history part, right? So this, again, this is a kind of snapshot synopsis of what I see as some of the key works in my reading of the history of digital rhetoric as a field. And Liz had already talked about Lannon's work in electronic word. I do critique that a little bit because he comes out specifically from literary studies and not from rhetoric per se, and never really gets back into rhetoric as the foundational tradition for his notion of the digital rhetoric practice. But it's still the kind of starting point that we can't, sadly I don't have any funny stories about carpeting. But I think this is the place that we have to go back to because we don't have precursors that we can find in the record so far. I also want to point to Kathleen Welch's book, Electric Rhetoric, because even though it's not about computers, it's not about computing, it is about video and it's about screens, right? And she starts her thinking about rhetoric with the sophists and does a really nice job of particularly looking at Socrates and how that filters into thinking about screens. So we have different mechanisms, different theories coming together. And then I'd say that probably the thing that touched off the whole mind interest in it was Jim Zappan's work in TCQ about digital rhetoric. And I spent a lot of time with that particular work, and ultimately I find that it holds up really, really well if you want to go back and look at something that provides a kind of definition and a space within which we could be working. It hasn't really lost its power for us, I think, as digital rhetoricians. So I would encourage everyone to use that, and you can expand upon it, which I'll also note in a moment. The other four pieces that I think are absolutely critical for anybody who's doing digital rhetoric, the kind of people who actually started defining digital rhetoric in clear and solid ways are, of course, in the center there we have Liz's virtual politics. It's a great job, and I'm going to unpack a little bit what she said about what digital rhetoric is. Since she was kind enough not to give us her definition last night, so I have something to say today. Bogus also talks about digital rhetoric in persuasive games, although I kind of take a critique of his work because he doesn't see this like larger expansive version of rhetoric that we've been talking about as the central core. He sees a kind of limited version of rhetoric, and so he reacts against that and says, well, we need to do this kind of procedural rhetoric as a new thing. But I think that can be encompassed within our traditional sense of how rhetoric works. And then, of course, Rhetoric Online by Barbara Warnick is one of the earlier pieces that a lot of people are influenced by thinking about rhetoric, although she focuses almost exclusively on the analytic. It doesn't talk about production hardly at all. So I think that's you've got all these different pieces that are coming together. They haven't yet gelled for me in a way that kind of clearly defines digital rhetoric, particularly in sense of a field. And I want to point out Lingua Franca, not just because Colin's giving the ending keynote, but because it features as a way of thinking about how we remediate, refigure, and re-theorize digital rhetoric in ways that I think are particularly powerful. So for me, these are the core texts. If I were making today a history of digital rhetoric course, we'd be reading the three we saw before, and these four, and a number of others as well, but these are the key ones for me. Okay, so now we put together the digital and the rhetoric to get digital rhetoric. We've got a little bit of a history of it. And here's Ian's notion, right? Digital rhetoric typically abstracts the computer as a consideration, focusing on text and image content. And his argument is that we need to also focus on the machines, on the production, right? On the processes, which I would agree with. I think we need to have that both and content and development, analysis and production. And he talks about procedural rhetoric, which I think is a very useful tool to add to our toolbox of digital rhetoric. But I would call it, like visual rhetoric, like computational rhetoric, subsets of the larger umbrella of digital rhetoric. So I'm a big picture guy. I like to make big pictures, like draw like where it goes where. If you really want to get a lengthy conversation about this, ask me about where technical communication is and how it works and what connects to professional writing and so on. But I think digital rhetoric works the same way. We have this kind of larger umbrella term under which we can use different theories and methods such as procedural rhetoric, computational rhetoric, and visual rhetoric play a role in it. Again, we're always going back to the central core of rhetoric. And here's Liz's definition, which I really, really like Liz's definitions. And she has 4 parts, right? I'm not going to critique these directly as I have in the past, except to say that the first 2 parts are really useful, and the third, I get a little queasy about that 4th bit, right? Because representation of human communication via a kind of mathematical formula or information processing model sometimes leaves out the people in the situation in ways that are not as ethical as I would like for digital rhetoric practice. There's a lot more to be said about that, but I will say that it's a really interesting way to think about digital rhetoric and where it can go. But I think there are some ways we need to be careful about how we take up and use some of these mechanisms from other fields if we're not careful to go back to remembering about the bodies, about the people, about the centrality of humans to rhetoric. And so what I came up with in the book, and is kind of it's almost a cop-out, right? It's application of rhetorical theory to digital text and performances. It's so broad, it's so basic, but I do that because I think it allows us the room to do a lot of different and interesting kinds of work, both theoretically and methodologically. And in the book, I get into that a little bit more deeply. To quickly tie back to Zappin's work, like he said, that digital rhetoric has these four things, right? Engages these four elements, these four kind of practices, right? Use of rhetorical strategies, identifying affordances and constraints of new media, digital identity, and social community. To which I would add, and I think we're going to continually be adding to those lists, particularly in the kind of work that we're doing here, development rhetorics of technology should be part of digital rhetoric. Right? Rhetorical methods for uncovering and interrogating ideologies and cultural formation in digital work should be part of digital rhetoric. Examination of rhetorical functions of networks should be part of digital rhetoric. Theorizing of agency, and here's where we get into that question of algorithms, right? Do software agents have agency is a really interesting question for digital rhetoric. Okay. There are a couple of competing terms, electric or electronic rhetoric, techno-rhetoric, computational rhetorics. I get into fairly deep detail about why I think these are not useful terms and that digital rhetoric should be the term that we're using. But given that we're at a digital rhetoric symposium, I don't think I really need to make that argument quite as clearly because we've already obviously bought into the big larger umbrella term, which makes me happy. So now I'm going to very quickly run through the theory, method, practice, pedagogy parts, right? Now that we've got some of the definitional work out. So I think that the three positions for theory for digital rhetoric, and I'm just going to very quickly kind of skim over all these because I think these are the things we're going to be connecting to in the rest of this symposium. The notion that can we apply classical rhetorical practices, methods, and theories to new digital forms, right? This is the question. Can we apply the traditional to the new? Or do we need to remediate the traditional to accommodate the new, right? And I would say that Colin's work is an example of that. Or do we need to come up with completely new rhetorical practices, theories, and methods in order to deal with the new forms that we have? For instance, both Jimmy Killingsworth and I think to some extent Jeff Rice have made a call for an appeal to cool being a new piece, right? A new central appeal that we can add to the classical ethos, pathos, and logos, right? That works a little bit differently and works specifically with media in different ways. That's a very interesting position, but I don't see a whole lot of people really forwarding new theories as directly, but I expect to see that coming out of the kind of work that's happening here. Sorry, these are just pictures of like remediating. This is a really interesting piece from Kairos that Paul Pryor and a number of folks did about rethinking the canon, the traditional canon, from the framework of thinking about new media and how those things can be changed. Right? So I recommend that also as a reading. Okay, finally, methods. Right? So basically, this is a long-winded way. Sorry, I'm throwing a wall of text at you, which is bad form. But it's a long-winded way of saying, like, we can use any methods we want. They can come from anywhere that we can use them, but we have to make sure that we always tie them back into rhetorical practice. And so this is where, if I had a lot of time, we talk about big data, we talk about distant reading versus close reading, and how those are both perfectly acceptable analytic methods for rhetoric, and what we would do with those kinds of things. What we can do is we start pulling methods from other places, like social network analysis, for instance, which comes out of a whole different tradition, but that we can use. Right? So I'm a kind of interdisciplinary methodological proponent, and some people would have problems with that because it takes a long time to really understand those methods from those other places. But I think if we invest our time and understand them well, and then fold in the kind of rhetorical work that we know how to do, that will be really productive for us. Okay, so finally, last slide, practice and pedagogy. This is what I'm working toward now in my next project, where I'm thinking about how both practice and pedagogy, methodologically, theoretically, and in production and analysis, we have three major areas that inform how we do work in digital rhetoric, and those are rhetoric, design, and code, and how those three things come together. But I'm going to leave that for another talk because I believe I'm just about out of time. So I want to say thanks to Justin and Scott for inviting me to come and speak to you all and to start so I can now relax and just listen to all the cool stuff you guys are going to tell me. So thanks very much.